Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a somewhat short story of the opening of Richardson Dees Park on June the 4th, 1900. Of course I don't have any photos from the time the park was opened, so I have used some more recent ones and I have spaced those out with a few little newspaper articles about the park in its first few years of life. Wallsend was an industrial town, built mostly thanks to the shipyards and the colliery industries. Public land was in quite short supply at the time. It's worth remembering that most open land was privately owned, such as the Hall grounds, which at this time was still a private garden belonging to Wallsend Hall. This would not become public land until some time later. It was a town which was growing rapidly, and it was felt that a park was something that was very much needed. As many of you probably already know, the land for the park was given to the council for the people of Wallsend by Robert Richardson Dees. What might not be known is that he had been approached and asked if any of his land could be used for such a purpose. So he had not just decided to hand over some unwanted land, but when asked he had very happily said that this land could not just be used but become owned by the town for public use. Mr. Dees was described as being a lover of nature, and he felt this land would give the people of the town a chance to enjoy this as much as he did. However, it wasn't what you would call ready to go. It had previously been used for one of the Wallsend pit shafts known as Sea Pit. There had also been pit houses on the land, so there was quite a lot of work to be done to make it into something suitable for the people of Wallsend to use for leisure purposes. Also, some of the land had been farmland, jointly farmed by Mr. Carr and Mr. Brewis. The areas where they worked had been known at the time as Carsdean and Brewisdean. Sadly, even with the description of the time, I can't quite work out exactly where these were located. The land would need to be laid out in a much better way with footpaths and grassed areas, and this was to be designed by Mr. G. Hollins. Work had begun with what was classed as a turf cutting ceremony. This was performed by Mr. J.B. Hunter in late December of 1898, with a view to being able to open the park to the public by the following summer, if possible. Winter would not have been my ideal time to start this work, but I assume they wanted to get things going as quickly as possible. Mr. Dees was at the ceremony, but he was unable to cut the turf himself. He was by this time quite an old man in his 80s, so the job was given to a younger man. Though it does seem that Mr. Hunter was the third choice for the job, as William Boyd would have done the job had he not been unwell at the time and unable to attend the ceremony at all. There was a lot to do, and this is something I didn't really know about until recently. There was actually a rather large pit heap that needed to be reduced. This was apparently situated where the children's play area was later located. It was described as being some 21 feet in height, and I did not realise there had been something in the park quite so high. It would seem that other interesting things were found whilst working on the landscaping of the park. The foundations of the original pit row were found close to the park lodge, and there was also mention in some reports of further pit shafts in the same location. Another find was the village well. This was described as a most interesting discovery. It was said to be found towards the western Dean. Now that sadly doesn't mean a lot to me, but maybe somebody listening knows just where that might have been. Sadly, the article doesn't go on to say what happened to said well, so if anyone listening has any further details about this, I would love to know that as well. The land for the park was described as being some 13.5 acres, and it was planned to have a bandstand, 2 bowling greens and a tennis court, a park lodge and also a lake, which it was hoped would prove popular with those who liked to sail model yachts. Also included in the plans were flower beds, the aforementioned footpaths, and of course seats for people to relax while watching the bowls or just to sit while passing the time of day. Flowers, trees and shrubs were to be planted, and there had even been mention of a fountain. but this part did not come until a little later and was perhaps not quite the kind of fountain they had originally intended to build. The total cost for the park was estimated to be around £6,000. This would be around about £900,000 in today's money. On the day of the opening, the streets of Wallsend were dressed in bunting. Articles describe barely a street without any, and that the entire population of the town appeared to be turning out for the ceremony. The estimated population at that time was over 20,000, so if they really all had been there, then the park would have been very crowded that day, and it would have been a bit like a game of musical chairs to get a seat. The park may well have opened to the public prior to June the 4th, 1900, but this was the official opening day. There was to be a horse parade which was leaving the old cycling ground sometime in the morning. The horses were described as being parading around the streets of Wallsend with a view to reaching the park in time for the opening. As it was said that the second parade of people and bands was not heading off until around 2:30 in the afternoon, the horses must have been parading around for quite some time. The second parade was along the high street to the park, and there were 3 bands who took part in this parade, and they were the Wesley Traineeship Band, the Wallsend Miners Band, and the Dudley Colliery Band. The actual articles about the opening say it was a lovely day, so there was a good turnout of the public for the occasion, but they don't quite go as far as saying 20,000 people. And of course, there was also a big turnout of the local, as described in the 1900 news articles and not my description, privileged people of the town. 2 platforms were erected at the entrance to the park for those included in this group to stand during the ceremony and listen to the speeches. There is a list of what feels like a million names of those who were there, but I will not include them all as it would be a little on the dull side, and most names we would not recognise today. But a couple of the names we might know are Mr. Dees and his sister, the Reverend and Mrs. William Marlowe O'Brady Jones of St. Luke's Church, Mr. and Mrs. William Boyd, and several other members of the Dees family. During the speeches, it was noted that Mr. Robert Richardson Dees had been a big part of Wallsend life for many years and had done many good things for the town, and that despite his age he still takes part in as much as he can, and that the gift of the land for the park was very gratefully received by the town. The majority of the speeches on the day were more about the town and its plans for the future, especially hoping that Queen Victoria would grant them the charter needed to create the borough of Wallsend, and also their plans to build the town hall. Mr. J.B. Hunter, on opening the park to the public, was presented with a key by Mr. O'Hanlon. This was a gold key, and it was given as a memento of the occasion, but it also actually opened the gates to the park. As soon as the gates were thrown open, the crowds outside cheered and slowly began to pass through them and into the park for their first official walks. After this, the dignitaries of the town headed off to the Masonic Hall for tea and more speeches. I have to admit I would have preferred to be walking around the park than listening to the speeches. While the public were taking their first walks, 24 girls from several local Sunday schools were collecting money for charity. This had been arranged by the Reverend O'Brady Jones. The whole day was classed as a great success, and it was hoped that the park would bring pleasure to the people of Wallsend for many years to come. Of course, Wallsend, or Richardson Dees Park to give it its full title, is still very much in use today and is loved by many. I know most Wallsenders have fond memories of the park from their own childhood and from still using it now with their grandchildren, etc. I hope that you have enjoyed this little short story, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again very soon.